of stories. Jaden mentioned emotional resonance. That oftentimes is talked about as one of the ones that's there, that a story without some sort of emotional resonance is not really a story. But it's a debatable. This is not a science. Is there any other ones that people have that they would add to those list of 5?
I would say like a prevailing sort of question that sort of overwraps.
Yeah, some sort of question or something that it's kind of pursuing towards. Okay. Any other thoughts of other ones that people would want to add?
I was thinking imagery or vivid language, word pictures, depending on the platform or medium.
Yeah, imagery, vivid language. And then you kind of can go into a spiral off of that, themes, devices, et cetera, right? And a lot of those are like, you can start to build out a definition that would be inclusive of the little bits and pieces that you kind of pick up along the way, right? But ultimately, there's got to be a way of you're telling the story, and whether it's that you're seeing it or that you're conjuring a feeling or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. So that's great. And again, that's kind of goes back to a point that I was making about on the first session, that in terms of stories, we all know stories so well because we live stories, and we really can't help but think in stories. And so it makes sense that we all kind of intuitively and kind of start to tease out what are some of the pieces of that stories. So I'll share back here to my screen, and I jump back and forth between my face and sharing some of the slides presented. And I love this drawing, and I include this drawing because this is a character from a book that I really, really love called the Earthsea Chronicles, or the Wizards of Earthsea, and it's written by Ursula Le Guin. And this is Ged, who's a wizard. And what I love about that stories and why I included it is because in that world that Ursula Le Guin has created, the power that sorcerers, and it's all about sorcerers and wizards and witches and magic, and the power that all of them have is the power of words. And they can wield power over things by naming things. And so everybody kind of hides their true name and has use names, because literally in the story, if you know something's true name, you have power over it. And I just think that's such a cool metaphor for the way that stories shape and stories guide and create, reality, basicly. And so I just included him in there because he's just such a great character, and kind of has formed some of my like philosophy or my thoughts about what story is. And so somebody jumped in here. I'm looking at some of the chat here, and purpose, and in typical kind of dad fashion, this is one of the things that I really think a story needs is a point. And I just looked up all the pencil point jokes that there was, and this is one that I thought was funnier than the rest. But I think that a story has to have a point, because I think that without a point of a story, it's an anecdote, or it's a series of events or something. And I think point is pretty broad and wide, because the point could be to entertain you. The point could be to make you laugh. The point could be to give you information. The point could be to, connect you with other people. There's a whole kind of list of it, but I really feel that without that point or purpose, that it's kind of like you would tell it to somebody and somebody would say, literally, what's the point? Okay, why'd you just tell me that? And then I think that necessarily isn't necessarily a story. And maybe you could say that it's a bad story, sure. But so in kind of going through, I came across this. I want to present this out. We're going to listen to a little bit of this talk here. This author, Thomas King, and he's reading in this talk that I'm going to play a little bit about the truth about stories. And in the beginning, and I'm going to do this now too to remind myself, is the land acknowledgement, right? And to acknowledge the fact that I today am on Albany, and I'm in the Haudenosaunee and Mohican people whose land that I'm on. And I want to acknowledge that. And he does that a great job. And he's a Canadian Indigenous writer as well. And the reason why I think the land acknowledgement is really important, and this is what we're going to talk about, is the way that storytellers have a tremendous power, and like Spider-Man, a tremendous responsibility with the stories that we tell. And what gets included, what gets not included, what gets painted becomes in a lot of ways reality. And this is what he says in this quote from a chapter called "You'll Never Believe What Happened" is always a great way to start, which is he kind of goes into that. But the truth about stories is that's all we are. And this is another quote from something else he wrote. I just want to include that if you tell a story enough times, it becomes true. I've always thought that because stories are so powerful, you have to be very careful which stories you choose to tell. And so I'm going to just play a little clip of him talking about some of this stuff. And I think we can kind of go from there.
There's a story I know. It's about the Earth and how it floats in space on the back of a turtle. I've heard the story many times, and each time someone tells the story, it changes. Sometimes the change is simply in the voice of the storyteller. Sometimes it changes in the details. Sometimes in the order of events. Other times it's the dialogue or the response of the audience. But in all of the tellings of all the tellers, the world never leaves the turtle's back, and the turtle never swims away. One time it was in Prince Rupert, I think, a young girl in the audience asked about the turtle and the earth. If the earth was on the back of a turtle, what was below the turtle? Another turtle, the storyteller told her. And below that turtle, another turtle. And below that, another turtle. Well, the girl began to laugh, enjoying the game, I imagine. So how many turtles are there, she wanted to know. The storyteller shrugged. No one knows for sure, he told her, but it's turtles all the way down. The truth about stories is that that's all we are. The Okanagan storyteller Jeanette Armstrong tells us that through my language, I understand I'm being spoken to. I am not the one speaking. The words are coming from many tongues and mouths of Okanagan people and the land around them. I am a listener to the language of stories, and when my words form, I am merely retelling the same stories in different patterns. You know, when I was a kid, I was partial to stories about...
So what I like about that is this idea that, you know, we are all the stories. And I think that humor part of what he says is that it just goes kind of infinitely, and that the little kid can't even, you know, can't break from it, that it's just, that's how it goes. And that's the reality of it. And really that last part, what he says about telling some of the same stories over in different patterns. And that's really the theme that we're going to talk about tonight, is what are the patterns and the structures of stories, and how do we use them to our fullest. I'm going to try to do this tonight, so bear with me throwing some notes in there. I like to just give people the links to some of the full talks or some of the resources that I can, because it's always good to kind of build resources. In a lot of ways, that's one of the things that I think I can offer is sharing some of the resources that I found exciting or interesting, or kind of made me think about stories in different ways, so that you can, you know, expand further. Because obviously in an hour talk, you know, we're not going to be able to go as deep as maybe we'd want to. And so it's always good to just kind of start in a direction, and to explore some more. So just a quick recap introduction about myself. My name is David Easton. I have spent 20 years in commercial production in one form or another, working on everything from dog food commercials to eBay commercials to promos for shows. I consider myself a storyteller, and that kind of crosses over into all sorts of mediums in terms of a writer, a screenwriter, a creative consultant helping businesses tell their story, and also an educator. And I've been an educator in public school. I've worked with adults in professional development on anti-racism work and things like that. And to me, always in all of these things, the story is the piece that's the through line to all of them, and what makes kind of connects all of those pieces together. Again, I said this last time, and just to say it again, I'm a work in progress, which means I'm doing the best that I can as a person and always trying to be better. So please, you know, if something seems, you can always correct me, and I appreciate that, and or offer your sense in how I got something wrong, or something that I maybe mistook or didn't get the whole picture to. I welcome that. Again, that I reject binary, embrace duality. I'm always an and person. You know, I may present an idea or thought and something, you hear that and say, well, what do you mean? What about this example? And I'm like, wonderful, and like that just complicates it. To me, the more that we can kind of live in some of those nuances is, and in that talk, actually, The Truth of Story, he goes into about the dangers of binary and how when we live in a binary world with words, what that does to us. So that's, if you dig into that, listen to that part, you can kind of explore that a little bit further. I tend to be a fast talker, big idea person who loves tangents. So again, please stop me if I'm going too fast, too far beyond what you can get. I love to have a conversation as opposed to just kind of me blasting out, which is why, again, I appreciate people jumping in on this as a meeting as opposed to a webinar. And I'm not made of sugar. There's, my mom used to say that if you go out in the rain, you're made of sugar, you're going to melt. And my point is that, I love to like dig into it. So,
May I test you on that, please?
Yes,
could you
please.
change to slideshow view, please, so that it's less busy and easier to see the main slide?
Yeah, can you, if I go like this, is that better?
Yeah, but if you could get rid of all the things, that would be better. But that's fine. That's much better. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, I was trying to do it, play it, but then it takes over my whole computer and I don't know how to I have two screens going. So
Thanks.
thank you. So let's see now, how do I advance? Oh boy.
Usually the arrow keys work.
Ah, that's it. Okay, good. See, now this is where I get tricked up. All right, well, I'm gonna jump back and I'll close this again. So here is kind of a working definition that we worked out about digital storytelling, combining oral tradition of storytelling with visual sound capabilities in digital media. I saw a great interview with Gary Vee, and I don't know if people who know who Gary Vee is. He's a person who was like he's considered an early adopter of kind of internet advertising. His family had a wine business, and he very early on started selling wine on the internet, and really it blew up and it made a bunch of money. And he's like a personality in TikTok and YouTube, and he's all about the internet. And I just saw an interview with him, and he was like, the internet, and we're digital babies. Like, we basically are still figuring out how all this works 10 years later, really, where we're carrying around phones in our pockets to make films and, or make videos and telling digital stories. And so all of this is so new. And so I love that his kind of like emergence in looking at this, that this is not something that's solidified, it's not something that's pinned down yet, that's really developing. And I think that that's part of what I have envisioned for this kind of talk about, really figuring out where are the baselines of story and how they can relate into the future, for that maybe we don't even know what that will be in terms of a medium. So I use this as a working definition for story. Purpose of a session, to think about that a story is a consecutive line of thinking, where you have connected thoughts, connected images through that follow a line. And I guess that really kind of hammers about the idea of the point, right? And that it has character and it has, setting, plot, narrative, etc. But that they all kind of go together in a consecutive line of thinking. And that's not to say that that has to be a straight line. I'm making this straight line. Tor and I were talking, the reason why I put Inception music on, Tor and I were talking about watching Inception in the movie theater, and that movie at first glance seems so twisted and wild, and it is, right? It's intertwined, but I've seen the notes on the screenplay notes of how they made that. And it's not, there's nothing left to accident. It's all, structured and together and tied together. And it actually all has purpose and meaning. And that's why I think it's a really effective film, because if somebody tried to make a movie about a dream within a dream within a dream and played like our real dreams, you'd have an avant-garde film or an experimental film that, wouldn't have the same success, I don't think, as Inception. And then again, to summarize with Alfred Hitchcock, that a story is life without the dull bits, or with the dull bits cut out. So I wanted to put this out here because, first of all, Alan Moore's picture makes me and my beard feel really groomed. But Alan Moore is a graphic novelist and a comic book writer who has written some incredible stuff: V for Vendetta, Watchmen, Swamp Thing. And I love this quote. I think that storytelling and creation are very close to what the center of what magic is about. I think not just for me, but for most of the cultures that have had a concept of magic, then the manipulation of language and words, and thus of stories and fictions, has been very close to the center of it all. And I really think that's what excites me, and why I put that picture of Get up there in the beginning from the Earthseas, is that there's this magical way about storytelling that creates reality and creates what wasn't there before, or also kind of shapes and gives people a lens to look at what is there. And so I also love this quote too, which I wanted to include because I love Octavia Butler, that every story I create creates me. I write to create myself. And I think that's true for myself as a storyteller and as a writer. And as I tell stories over and over and over again, there's similarities, but there's differences, and there's ways that they grow and that they change me. And that I think that that part of it is we're also creating ourselves as well. And so here's what I wanted to talk about. So when I talk about story structure, this is a topic that is written about in books to exhaustion. There are arguments on the internet about this. There are, as a film student, this is one of those things that was just ground into my head, right? To the point that I almost felt like, well, this is what we're talking about. And so like, that's like the only thing is important, I mean. And so I've included here now, these are 3 kind of lenses in which are very typical, usually looked at stories from the Western tradition. And so this first one here is the hero's journey. And if you don't know about what the hero's journey is, you should definitely check it out, because once you read about, basically Joseph Campbell studied myths from all different parts of the world and all different kind of stories, and started to put together an overarching structure that was within all these stories. And there's so much debate of how much he pulled and pushed and twisted to, let me see, somebody's giving me, okay. How much it was twisted and pulled and put to make the stories fit this structure. But chances are, if you watch a American movie, it falls into this structure more or less, for better or for worse, okay? And you can follow in the way that this little graphic organizer kind of organizes what the hero's journey is you have a person, right? And they're called to adventure in one way or another. They're given some sort of aid that's either magical, or they're given a tool, or they're given guidance from a helper that then helps them cross through this threshold. And they have challenges and temptations, and they battle, the different pulls and forces, and they have some sort of massive death, abyss, rebirth, revelation, and that leads to transformation, which then leads to atonement, and they get some sort of gift or some sort of like acknowledgement of this, and then they return home. And Joseph Campbell really posited that this was the story, that this reason why this story was an underlying structure in all of these other stories was that it was the story of us, our lives, and that this is the story that we live all the time, that we sit in, and whether you can put yourself in this situation, you can think of all different situations, right? Like whether it's a job, going to a job, or going to college, or going to try to use your career as a writer, or I've decided I'm going to be a storyteller. You could put yourself in there, and you could probably tick off the different pieces and parts of that cycle and how it returns, you return home succeeded. And so that's like, this is like foundational. It's one of those things that, again, you see, you hear, it's just squished in your head in all sorts of movies and television. And we're not going to talk about it more than that tonight, because if you haven't heard about it, you should definitely check it out. You should definitely become familiar with it. You should look into it. And if you have heard about it, you probably have heard about it the way that I'm describing, and it doesn't need any more talking about it. And what I want to do is go a little bit in a different direction. But also, you probably, if you haven't heard of the hero's journey, you've probably heard of the 3-act structure, which is Act 1, the beginning, right? Act 2, the middle, and Act 3, the conclusion. And so this is a thing that's used all the time, especially in script writing and writing out for movies, but also stories, that has this, kind of predictable, repeatable story structure. And this is another one that's debated, because in other cultures, and also when people look at different plays and they say, no, there's no such thing as a 3-act play, it's actually all 5 acts, and there's 5 acts to a story, and some people are just condensing it down into 3 acts. And then other people go, well, what about these great tradition of stories that's there's 2 acts. There's a world that it was, and then there's a world that happens after this event, and there's a discussion about that. And then, if you try to fit some of the Indian myths and the Indian like epics into this, like you're lost, because it's like they're way bigger. There's like way more than 3 acts. You can't condense it into those, but they're stories, right? So it's a tool to use to kind of think, does my story fit into this? Does this go through this arch? And what I'll do is I'm going to throw this into the chat for a second too, just pardon me. There's a great, where is it? There's a great, it started out as a Twitter account, and it became a blog called Hulk Film Critic, and I'm putting the link in here. And one of he's written a book out of these tweets. That the tweet became a book, and basically he writes film reviews and reviews of stories in the voice of Hulk. So it's like all capitals. It's like short, growly sentences, and he hates and just goes to town on the fact that there's no such thing as a 3-act structure, and then it's utterly insane to think that. And here's why. And let's look at how you're skewing the evidence. And it's like his passion. And again, he wrote a book called like Screenwriting 101 that really was springboarded off of this blog and this Twitter account called Film Critic Hulk. So check that out. It's pretty humorous. He used a lot of curse words. It's pretty funny, but he gives reviews of movies in the voice of Hulk. And then, as if there wasn't any more need for graphic organizers to analyze story structure, you have Freytag's pyramid, which is kind of similar to the 3-act period, 3-act structure, but it's a little bit more of this kind of like cycle, and it kind of like is about repeating and going back and repeating and going back again. And you have, something happens, right? It gets rises, it gets complicated, it gets to a point of climax where things have to change, the turning point. That's a term that's always used in storytelling all the time. There's something where there's no going back. It's the moment in Star Wars when Luke is looking at his aunt and uncle's skeletons in the smoke, and he knows that the world that he knew once before on Tatooine as a farm boy is done. And now he doesn't know what's going to happen next, but he knows he can't go back to the way that he lived. I mean, that's just like a perfect example of that turning point. And then you have this reversal, a falling action kind of coming down from that. And then the denouement, which is like that moment of release, that feeling of like, everybody gets their medals and they kind of like, right. And it's this way that this repeats itself. So again, these are all great tools, and they're all worthwhile to look into. And I would encourage you to, if this feels that something unfamiliar or something you'd really want to look into and you want to get into, I would definitely pursue some of those. But I'm not gonna go into those because they're, like I said, there's just tons of books. And I think that there's something even more productive, because not everybody's writing a screenplay, who's in here. Not everybody who is writing a story is thinking about how to do this. And in a lot of ways, I think about storytelling like cooking. And I started out as no ability to cook. And then my wife was like, yo, you better start cooking. And so I need a recipe. And so without a recipe in front of me, I will make something that's inedible. And so I follow the steps. And to me, that's like a structure, right? And it's like, I've written stories that follow the recipe of these structures, and they're boring and they're terrible. And they're like just kind of like rote, and they're kind of thing. And I read a great Twitter thread where somebody was saying there's like a conception out I follow a lot of screenwriters on Twitter, and they're like, the conception out in the industry somehow that like you're going to write the perfectly structured screenplay, and that's like what's going to get you to break through into the industry, or that's what somebody's going to want to make your film because it's perfectly structured. It's not true. It's just not true. These are great tools. My wife can open up a pantry and she can pull ingredients together and make something that's delicious and far more delicious than I can do with the recipe. And that's kind of what I want to get into, is where is the magic? And there's something magical about the way she can cook. And I think there's people who do that. I would call it magic when they cook that way. No recipe, they just have a sense, right? And so what I want to do is I want to tease out, how can we hone that sense? How can we identify what we can do and how we can kind of tell our stories the best without having to stick to some sort of big structure? Another great one, this is another great resource. I'll throw the full link in here. This article is incredible, from The Atlantic. If you're ever interested in writing a sitcom or thinking about sitcoms, or even just love sitcoms, check out this article, and I'll put the link to the whole thing in the chat. But you could also probably just Google the title of it, because this breaks it down. And sitcoms are like this, because once you read this, it's incredible. Is that sitcoms are minute to minute, like broken out and constrained. And when sitcoms don't follow that pattern, they fail. And there's a whole course of like the dead bodies of sitcoms that might have had a great idea, might have had great actors, might have had great talent, but did not follow this like structure. Great, thanks, Tor. Did not follow this structure, and they just don't succeed. You don't get the laughs. You don't, like, it's just not funny in the way that the sitcoms that we all know are. And what's wild is this person who was like, you know, got a job to write for Croatian TV and decided they needed to like figure out how to do this, goes through and they're just like, you know, in the first 3 minutes, this is what's going to happen. 2 minutes after that. And it's wild, because you start getting that and you watch, and if you read this and you get that and you watch sitcoms, you're just like, oh my God, it's really true. It's really, really true. And so that's a case where really learning the structure like is essential, and that a script for a pilot or for a television show that doesn't follow that recognizable pattern, like it's like won't be readable. It's just something that won't be successful in the way that we want it to be successful. And then this is like one of my favorite, one of those, I've got a bunch of old videos to show tonight, or a couple of old videos to show. And this is one of my favorite for a couple of reasons. And this is kind of going to start to transition us away from thinking about these ideas of like the prescription or the recipe for writing a story, and more into some of that magic. And so I'm going to share this.
Has created a body of work of startling eccentricity and universal appeal. His singular view of the world applies not just to his stories and characters, but to some of his theories as well.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really, is the shape of the curves of what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average, is why get a depressing person? We'll start, the whole thing, we call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories about below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her a means of transportation, goes to the party, dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now, there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes, the shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
So I love that video because I love Kurt Vonnegut, first of all. And I just love the way he's talking about being able to study the shapes and the curves from a pattern standpoint, right? This idea of where we go. And a lot of times what that's called is the arc. And that wasn't something we identified in one of the stories, in kind of the necessities for stories, but people often talk about that as a necessity for a character. That a character who starts the story in the beginning and ends the story in the same place is a boring story. And that really throughout the plot, throughout the conflict, through the resolution, right, that there should be some sort of arc. And I think that that's a valid point, and I think it's something that might be included in the idea of what a story is. But I watched this video the other day, and for the first time in my entire life, I rethought the Cinderella story. And I said, we tell that story over, he's right, we tell that story over and over and over and over again, right? And there's movies called Cinderella Man, right, that's about boxing. And the moral of that story comes out that we can like achieve greatness from the bottom and come from the bottom and get to the top, right? And it never occurred to me after hearing that story, reading that story, that how do we get there? Because I think that it becomes a short term for like hard work or the American dream or doing something, right? But the story actually, the intersection that what changes things is the benevolence of the support of somebody else. And I think that that's just like a wild part that's hidden in plain view of that story. And I think it gets mistold and misunderstood. So that's just like a little sidebar that in watching this, I was like, wow, are we all missing the point of what the Cinderella story is? That it's not the pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, but it's that to be able to get from laying in the ashes to the ball, you need the help of somebody along the way. But so in kind of going from there and deciding what, if we're looking at the shapes and the arcs and things like that, where does the magic lie in the story, in the details of it, right? And here's where I think it gets molecular and it gets atomic. Because, and this is where I'm bringing back Dr. Manhattan from, oh, sorry, Jaden, you got your hand up. Thank you, Tor.
So I kind of wanted to add that there are also stories that I've heard of, because like it didn't occur to me that a story could still be dynamic without the character necessarily being dynamic. because there are two other story structures that there's one where like the character is impactful enough that they change their situation around them substantially. Like the one that gets mentioned a lot is like the Donner Superman movie or the two Paddington movies, where it's not the character who changes, it is the impact of the character that changes the situation around them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if not, there are stories like, gonna get a little obscure here, but One Piece is this super long running narrative where the characters don't really change that much, but their situation is constantly changing and is constantly a dynamic, and like it's it's very well thought out, and like you can still track their entire journey even though this manga has been going for like 20 years now. Just thought I'd bring that up as like an alternative to like, yeah.
For sure, absolutely, and actually, Vonnegut, there's a more modern version of that video where he's a little bit older and he's kind of takes a little bit longer to take out his things, but he's added 2 stories to it, and he's added the modern stories of like basically the metamorphosis from by Franz Kafka, where a character starts off in terrible circumstances and they only get worse, and so to infinity, right? And that's a story we watch. Absolutely, we've seen Breaking Bad is a great example of watching a character who has a bad situation, it just gets bad and worse over time, right? It just goes worse and worse and worse. And every episode you're like, oh my God, how could it get even worse? And then it gets worse, right? And then there's another one he does, which is like a flat line, kind of like what you're saying. And he says that's actually Hamlet. He's like, where nothing really changes. It just stays the same and the world kind of around them is changing, but the character themselves is actually stuck in inertia. And you're 100% right? And so by no means are those arcs exhaustive, but I think that it's helpful to think about the different patterns and the different ways that we see and we tell stories. Thank you for jumping in and adding that. I appreciate it. And Tor, thank you for bringing attention to Jaden's hand up. So this is Dr. Manhattan from the graphic novel by Alan Moore, Watchmen, and he's this kind of all-knowing, all-atomic person. And so when I talk about kind of uncovering some of the magic of story, I want to get molecular. I want to get atomic. And so something that I call the montage, and it's not me calling this, it's kind of a film term, and film term it's become mean like an editing thing that shows you time, series of things put together. But I'm using this with a capital M. And it was kind of put out by a Russian editor named Sergei Eisenstein. And he goes into it in one form, but this is probably the easiest, best form to show you what I mean by this. And so if you're taking this is a panel of a comic, right? We're colliding this idea right here, this image, with this image right here, right? And if these existed solely only on the page, we know what happened. Our mind completes the picture. Our mind says, oh, that person closed their eyes. By the putting these two things together, right in this gap in here in the middle, we fill it in with what happened. And this is just a small example. And these examples are from a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is like crucial. Right, yes, exactly. If you were reading a manga reader, it would be them opening eyes, right? But Understanding Comics is an incredible, like, deep dive into the way that visual storytelling works. And he uses lots of great examples. Here's another great example that he uses. Okay, we see this is following the action. Without being told what's happening here, we are able to get the story. We're able to put the pieces together and create the story in our mind. Yeah, Jaden's got it, exactly. Here's another one, right? And some of these take a little bit more detective work on our part, a little bit more thinking, right? And in a lot of ways, when it takes more thinking, it becomes more engaging. But in this panel right here, right? Now you died, no, we know what happens. And this happens in really, I would argue, in every story that we tell, whether it's a video, whether it's comic, whether it's in memes, whether it's, you name it, that what we're doing is we're taking in that idea of consecutive thought, right? We're taking one thing and we're taking another thing and we're putting them together. And that's what Eisenstein, the Russian editor, meant by montage. because he was actually physically editing film together. And he said, by taking the meaning of this thing and taking the meaning of this thing and putting them together in time, we create a whole other meaning. And that is the basic and the essence and the most granular atomic structure of story. And so if we can really understand that that's where the magic of story lies, right? And then you take that and it grows out from there, right? And you can then apply that and use that no matter what your story is for, who it's for, what audience it's for. If you can use that and really extract the most power out of it, that is where the power of the structure of the film lies. And so here's kind of the breakdown from that book. And this all exists on one page. I had to break it up to be able to be readable. But Scott McCloud makes himself a character in that book, and he talks about what's happening throughout. And he says, see that space between the panels? That's what comic aficionados have named the gutter. And despite the unceremonious title, the gutter plays host to much of the magic and the mystery that are at the very heart of comics. Here, in the limbo of the gutter, human imagination takes two separate images and transforms them into one single idea. And I think that why I get so excited about that is because in understanding that and knowing that and using that, its application is infinite. It can be used anywhere because you can take the power of that in stringing together your consecutive line of thought and take one idea and another idea and put them together. And if you're really conscious and considering and thinking about the order in which you're putting them together, what information you're putting, into that one piece and versus the other piece, right? And you put them together, boom, that's where the magic of story comes from. And this is one of my favorite little examples of this. This is what Eisenstein did as a test. And it's really old. It's from the early days of filmmaking, but I'm going to show it to you. And so this is called the Kuleshov effect. And so he takes this image and he takes this shot of food and soup and puts it next to this guy's expression, right? And then he takes a dead baby or a dead kid in a coffin and puts it next to the same exact expression. And now the third one, he takes a woman laying on a couch and puts it next to his face, right? It's the same expression in all three of these instances, the same clip of film. But truly, and this is, it's a little bit, because it's dated, I like to show the original version of it. But ultimately, you have his face plus, the dead child is sadness. The same exact face, no difference. There's no emotion that's on his face. It's a blank slate. That's the whole point. Plus soup equals hunger, that he's looking at it hungrily. And that, again, you have this plus, the picture of the woman, and that's lust. And that by doing that, that is like how an editor basically creates meaning in putting things together. And so we have that power at our fingertips. I'm going to pull up, let me see here. And so one of the thoughts that I wanted to kind of put out there with this was, does anybody have any questions about that or any thoughts about that? Okay, cool. So this quote here I wanted to bring up, and this is kind of a connection to this because it's another way that we can use the structure, right? And it's that an Ursula Le Guin quote that the unread story is not a story, which is true, right? So it's like, how do we get our story, how do we get to even this point where we're putting the pieces together? And now this is what I teased last time, just because I thought it's silly to tease this, a frame apart from Roger Rabbit. And now this is set up, the judge is looking for Roger Rabbit. The judge is trying to capture him, bring him in for a crime that he thinks is committed, and Roger Rabbit's hiding. So I'm gonna play this. I think the sound should.
Say, boy, you always should resemble the place.
Oops.
Say, boy, you always should resemble the place.
No, Sergeant. Disassembling the place won't be necessary.
So he says, disassembling the place won't be necessary.
Come right to me.
So that's a silly illustration, which I like to use because what's happening in that scene, the audio is not so great. So I'll break it down, is that Judge is looking for Roger Rabbit. And he's like, we're going to tear this place apart to find him. And he says, we won't be tearing it apart. And he starts, and he just does the knock of dot, 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 right? And do it yourself. Feel it yourself right now. You can't not complete it. You feel the compulsion. You have to complete it because that is the way story works. And so if we are able to, as storytellers, put out that piece, which is that first idea, in a way that's compelling and interesting, our audience, it cannot help but want to know the completion of that. We want to know, Scott McCloud calls it conclusion, or he calls it, I forget what the term he uses, but basically that in that image of seeing the eye open, right, and knowing something's coming later, we just need to have the completion. We just need it, need it, need it. And so in that, in thinking of how we use that, I wanted to kind of even deviate from, from the idea here that's what's basically called a story gap. And that to understand the power of a story gap is to understand what compels the human brain toward desire. And that quote comes from this book right here, which if you are like a marketer or you're helping businesses kind of tell your story, this book is like hot fire because it takes the hero's journey arc and the story about the hero's journey and tells it how you use that for telling the story of a brand, of a company. And it's so ingrained into us that to be able to like understand and need that it's an effective tool. And in that book, he breaks down how, Apple does it, how Google does it in this way that is just like, you're like, oh yeah. And I'm a victim to it all the time. I just get sucked into it. And so being able to use it to our advantage. But so this part and how we can even use that, like, let's say you're writing emails to somebody. It's a study looking into by including an emoji in the subject line of an email. There's a more of a read rate compared to other, this is like compared to other emojis, but it's also compared to other emails. It's also less likely to get deleted, less likely to get labeled as spam. And why I say that, why I even include the idea of an email is we've all written emails and we all have tons of emails that are sitting in our inbox unread, right? Because what I would argue is that the subject line is our story loop, and it's that first idea, and that we know that when that story loop is just not compelling, we're not really caring about what's going to follow with that. It's not going to like matter to us. It's descriptive or something, right? And then when you go, maybe the pieces don't even relate and they don't put it together. But we have an opportunity to basically start a story loop, start a storytelling by putting that little piece out there that opens up a story loop that our brains want to complete. And that then we have that opportunity within the body of the email to put that next piece together, to put them together to create an emoji, or to create new meaning. And so you're asking about the subject line of reply girl email. They were all for Valentine's Day promotions. Companies put out Valentine's Day promotions, including kisses and smoochy faces and hearts, and tracked the results of which ones were open and which ones weren't, because we can do that with email, which is great. So my kind of like basic idea in pulling this out is that if we look at the granular ideas of story and the atomic level, and that it's idea pushing against another idea in like montage or in juxtaposition, and that we know that meaning is created by the juxtaposition of those two together, that we can create better emails to people that will get them to open it. We'll be able to tell that story that loops up and gets the interest of our audience kind of immediately. And that once we kind of understand that part and that little piece of understanding where that meaning comes from on a very small level, then we can start to apply that to bigger structures, to things like the hero's quest or the hero's journey or the 3-act, right? But that by just following those kind of larger structures from the start, we may miss out on some of the baseline opportunities and really where that magic of storytelling lives. So time has caught up and caught against me. I'm a big fan of honoring the commitment that you've made in terms of the time that you're being here, but I'm absolutely down and to be here and talk and answer any questions or any kind of thing that anybody wants to do afterwards, because I feel the clock ran out on me quickly, and I felt a little bit, rushed at the end. So if there's anything that I kind of was going through that didn't make sense and anybody wants to talk about it, I could hang out for a couple minutes or two. But thank you so much for checking out part 2. And I hope that you tune into part 3 next Thursday too.
And just, I shared David's, we'll keep the room open. And so if people want to hang out a bit, please do. I'm just going to very quickly share a link to register for the upcoming sessions. And now I'm going to give you a big old content dump. I will also email this, but this is, what's happening here? These are links from everything from tonight. Oh, it won't let me do it. Too many things. All right, I'm going to parse these out. So feel free to keep talking. I'm going to start just adding links, and I'll also email all of these to everybody, so you don't need to worry about copy and pasting them and grabbing them from the chat.
Tor, thank you so much. That's amazing. Yeah, Bree.
How would you compare the starting a story loop to what's I've often heard called a hook?
Yeah, I think that it's probably the same thing. And as a teacher and going through education, learning about how to become a teacher, the hook was what was drilled into our head. You need a hook. A lesson needs a hook, right? And I think that there's something cynical about that, about what that means. It's like that you need to grab your audience in a way that pulls them in, right? And there's something, I don't know, like fishing for it, where I guess the subtlety where I would say that the story gap to me is a better way of describing that is because it's acknowledging that we all want to complete it. We all want the complete, where a hook is kind of like I picture a barker, a salesperson be like, come, to me, that's actually what makes me think of is clickbait, where, the email, it's like finding out what's, you'll never believe the top 5 tips that all the celebrities are using or something. And you're kind of like, oh, okay. And it's a story loop, but to me, that's a hook, because I don't ever expect what's going to follow is actually going to meet that thing. Where to me, a story loop is an opportunity of opening up our desire to fill in meaning in a meaningful way that we then can't help pursue. So it's very similar, I think.
So that's interesting, because it's more of an interaction.
Yeah, and
the story and the audience.
I think so. Yeah, and I think that is where the power, absolutely, and that's where that power of storytelling lives. Is that how we create something that gets the imagination of our audience churning and participating in it, right? As opposed to just, that's what is the difference between story and just information. If I was just downloading information to you, you might just receive it, right? But you're not necessarily engaging with it, where story gets you to engage. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for highlighting that point, because that's a really crucial part, I think.
Thanks. Eileen's trying.
Eileen's got a hand.
Oh, right on, Eileen.
Go for it.
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all in person this time. Oh, wow, waves. Yeah, so the story, I just find the story gap and the gutter concept so interesting, because I have some background in storytelling, and I took a screenwriting class forever ago, and we focused so much on structure, but really not those more nuanced pieces. So and this is kind of how I learn, is repeating things, but it's almost like that's the thing that makes you want more. As a reader, I'm recognizing when you're telling me this, that when there's a story gap, I'm like, where are they going with this? I need to know what happens next. And in creating those, it's like what Bree said, it's that engagement. Yeah?
Yes, 100%. And that was why I wanted to get to the atoms of it, because 100%, you can go through the structure of something and putting out information following the structure, right? But without really understanding that at the base and at the core, right, you want your audience to be and that's where that, the quote about, what does he say? You'll never believe what happened, right? That's a great way to start. It is a great way to start, because our minds, and this is kind of connecting back to last week's, we just can't help it, because that's what we do. That's what our minds do in reality, is we just can't help but want that completion, that closure. That's the word he uses, closure. And so then you've got your audience participating with you inside their head. Yeah, 100%.
It's like when someone says, I don't know if I'm supposed to tell you this. I guess not. And it's like, you have to tell them now.
Yes, 100%. And so if we can use that atomical power in our storytelling, right, it's just going to be more powerful no matter
Yeah.
what kind of story we're telling. Yes, exactly.
Awesome. I think
Yeah,
that's
Jaden.
neat.
Jaden.
So the whole story gap thing is really making me think of I think what's something that's really underused is in like a series, something like a midquel, because a lot of times what certain series will do, that I see this a lot in game series specifically, they will give you like the important things about the story to make the plot of the game you're playing right now make sense, but leave these little gaps that, like, not to the point where it doesn't make sense, despite what people will tell you about the one I'm going to bring up as an example. It's enough to get you to wonder, and it makes you like want to play the next one right away to see if it fills in the gap.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
like,
That's a great case in point. Exactly.
Like Kingdom Hearts is the example I think of. I'm playing through the series right now. Played this little in between that was released after that wasn't numbered, and then 2, and there are all these story gaps. And I'm starting to play this one now. This is like a little spin-off called, like, it has a weird convoluted, because it's from Japan. It has a weird convoluted title, but it feels like a keystone to the rest of the series I've played thus far. It's filling in all these gaps, and it's so satisfying to play through it and see all these gaps get filled in.
Exactly. And that part, the satisfaction, is a great way to phrase it, right? And it's like, that's like, I think what we want our audience to feel is the satisfaction that you have created a story gap that got them excited and interested, and then you've completed it for them, right? And that is like the journey. And I think, people can argue about this. There's movies, there's stories, right, that leave you feeling without the completion of that. And then you go out afterwards after seeing a movie and you have to talk about it. Inception's an interesting one, right? But to think about like that. And that can be used as well too, right? But I think that still, like, acknowledging that we all want that, really. And that, there's only a certain level to which you can play with that and still have your people, your audience coming back for more, because they're just gonna be, no, you just mess with us all the time and you never complete it. Lost is a good example of that. How far could you take the endless story loops that just don't really complete, And
God, J.J. Abrams and his mystery boxes.
Exactly. And just to, in terms of time, we could talk about this forever. I just want to make sure that anybody else has a chance to ask something or say anything before, because I also know that Tor isn't, in here forever either too. So. Okay, cool. I'm looking, just kind of scanning through everybody.
Wait,
So
I see Hassan with a hand up.
Oh, right on. Perfect.
Yeah. So, I think you kind of completed my question about the overarching question. It comes between that sort of juxtaposition and how you're telling the story as well, as opposed to just the main question of why is this character doing something. So, like, sharing that. But so I'm kind of thinking about, like, horror movies, and how, like, people say that horror movies kind of suck or whatever, or talking about different tropes and how they may or not be beneficial or detrimental to a story, and how people try to see if that question is answered or keep them engaged. I'm just interested about that.
Yeah, and one of the later kind of sessions in the series that I'm doing is all about, like, tropes and things like that, and whether because there's certain ways that tropes serve the story by giving us information that's very easy to consume and we've seen before, so we don't have to go too deep into a character, right? We've seen that character many times, we know, and it serves the story. And then there's ways that they just end up being sexist and racist and perpetuating these harmful loops and stories and arcs that don't do anybody any good, and that we should really just get rid of them. So that's, like, absolutely a great point, and that's, like, I addressed kind of those in one of the later sessions. I think it might be the last one or the second to last one.
Cool. But
I would absolutely, again, just can't say enough about this book and understanding comics and really getting into what happens in there. And it's there's an amazing part where it compares, different stories from different parts of the world and the different what happens in the little gaps between them, right? Where American stories, and goes in film, American stories follow action more often than not, right? And then Japanese stories do this whole thing where they'll show like a simmering pot on a stove, the stove, the birds outside. What's the idea that's being generated by putting those things together that isn't following action? It's like setting a mood and a tone. So it doesn't always have to just follow action and completion, right? There's a whole bunch of other stuff. And, there's a whole level to which how much more it takes you to think. That one that when you see the eye opening and the eye closed, there's very little thinking you have to do in there. There's very little engagement, right? But you could do totally non sequitur one, and you could create, like a falling leaf and a big building. And you're like, what is the meaning in those two things? And you could just spin off on that forever, right? And that's maybe what your goal is to get people really into that deep of thinking. But yeah, thank you for bringing up the idea of tropes and how they do, because we're going to talk about that one later. That's a whole other topic. Bria, and then I think this will be maybe the last kind of question, just in respect of time. I'd love to talk about this all night, but yes, please.
Have you seen the great book, 99 Ways to Tell a Story?
No.
It's really fun. It's each page is a different way of telling a narrative. And it's a story of a guy gets up, walks to the refrigerator, asks somebody what time it is. The person answers, he opens the refrigerator to get something out. And it shows 99 ways to tell the story, including the perspective of the refrigerator, where it's just dark, 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 light, dark, dark, dark. But it's very cool because it gets into all the different narrative styles and approaches and perspectives and things.
That's awesome. That sounds really great. And that has so much to do with a topic we're going to touch on in another session as well about, what if multiple stories and what if we're following, how do those all kind of go together? Because that's really what life is, right? We all have our own little story, right? So how do they intersect and how do they get together in something that's cohesive? That sounds awesome. I'm definitely going to check that out. Great. Well, thank you guys so much again. This is awesome. I love it. It's a great way to spend a cold Thursday night talking about story. And I hope you join me for the next one next week.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Nice to meet everybody.